Thank you so much to all three of you, Paula Rappaport, Gayle Rubin, and Vi Johnson. I'm sorry if I'm a little cavalier in the way I thank you, but it's just that we need to move quickly, and I apologize if I don't take as much time as I should to thank you. There were some questions, but I think we'll take them later at the end. We need to move to Jim Ward and Elayne Angel. Jim is going to be interviewed by Elayne Angel now for the next session to introduce the
So,
next session.
Jim, are you there? Are you unmuted? Can
I
you hear
just
me?
unmuted, yes.
Okay, great. Well, first off, I wanted to congratulate you on the well-deserved honor.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask if you could tell everybody about how you first got into the leather scene.
Well, I think the whole BDSM, at least in fantasy form, has been with me since the onset of puberty. But I actually got into the leather scene when I was living in New York in the late 1960s. I met a couple of guys who were very much involved in the scene who introduced me to the leather bars in New York and also to the New York Motorbike Club, which I became a member of. This is a photo of me at the New York Motorbike Club clubhouse. Was down at the foot of Christopher Street, not far from the leather bars. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to say that I know piercing wasn't popular or common at the time that you first got into it. So I was curious about what sparked your interest in piercing.
It actually began quite by chance. I read a magazine article about a man who had uh, taken his boat on a voyage around the world. And when he returned home, he had one of his ears pierced to commemorate that event. And there is a naval tradition of piercing ears and sometimes other body parts when you make some significant voyage. And this fetish, if you will, sort of evolved, became very strong that I wanted one of my ears pierced. And I had met a man named Ron at the New York Motorbike Club who had his ears pierced. He had been a merchant marine. And I asked him to pierce my ear, which he did subsequently, and I still have that piercing to this day. And then as it happened, this fantasy began to take shape of, gee, wouldn't it be very sexy to pierce my nipples? And that became another obsession. And eventually I got brave one weekend and found a push pin and a cork from a bottle of wine and pierced my nipples. I had made a couple of little rings from some very thin gold wire that an ex-lover of mine had in his watchmaking kit. And those were my first piercings.
Wow.
Soon
Sounds
after
brutal.
that, I was out at one of the leather bars one night, and there standing by the bar uh, under one of the lights was this handsome man named Fernando. And lo and behold, he had pierced nipples. And that was, I no longer felt like I was the only person in the world who had this obsession.
I know that feeling, and I was so happy to find you when I did and realize that I was not the only person. Fernando.
He was a very sexy man who made several porn movies, actually, and most of them were pretty crappy, but he was still a hot guy. and an inspiration.
So that was your personal interest, but how did piercing evolve into a business? And I must say, I'm so glad that it did.
Well, it's all rather fateful, actually. I moved on to Denver and joined the local motorcycle club there. And I was in Denver only for a few years until I ended up on the West Coast in West Hollywood. And through, this is me in Denver on my Moto Guzzi, but I had met a man at the motorcycle club there in Denver. The club was called the Rocky Mountaineers, and I'd met a man named Rod, and he took off for California on his Harley and settled there. And I connected with him after I moved to California, and he took on a job as a bus driver. Met a man named Tom on his regular route, and they got to talking about piercing one day. And at about that time, a guy got on the bus with a pierced ear, and the conversation between Rod and Tom turned to the subject of piercing. And Rod said to Tom, "Oh, I have a friend who has his nipples pierced." And Tom said, "Oh, I'd really like to meet him." And I subsequently met Tom, who introduced me to Doug Malloy, who became my mentor and friend. And it was at Doug's suggestion, once he discovered I knew how to make jewelry, he suggested that I start a business. And that's how Gauntlet came into being.
So that initial clientele was from the leather community, I take it?
Doug had connected with actually quite a few people, gay and straight, around the world. But he also, excuse me, had put a classified ad in the local gay press, hoping to meet guys who were interested in the subject. And from that, we started to promote piercing there locally with these monthly T&P group meetings where we would get together once a month and have a potluck or go to a restaurant and then go to my place or someone else's place, and I would pierce whoever was interested.
And how did you parlay that into a storefront?
Well, I first worked out of my home and did mail order business mostly, although there were people who would come to the house. I had introduced myself to the Pleasure Chest there in West Hollywood, which is no longer there, I believe. But they would refer people to me from time to time. And so I realized at a certain point that the only way to really have a legitimate business was to open a shop. And that's what I did in 1978. I opened the shop there in West Hollywood. My clientele initially was primarily gay men, mostly leather men. And then it kind of was like dropping a stone in a pond. It continued to ripple out into the straight SM world, into the bikers and the punks, and it just kept evolving. And then came 1989 and the publication of the book Modern Primitives, and it exploded.
It certainly did. I have a very brief little story, which was in 1981 when I came into Gauntlet to get my nipples pierced, and I did think I was the only other freak in the world until I found you guys over there. And you said to me, "I'll bet you'd be interested in a demonstration I'm doing this weekend at the Janus Society Clubhouse. You should probably come along." And that was my introduction to the SM scene. So I got into piercing first, and thanks to you, you let me know about your involvement with the local leather community, which was a pansexual group, and I ended up showing up there. So I wanted to thank you very much for that invitation, and thank you also for sharing all your knowledge about piercing with the world. You have truly made a difference. The world would be quite a different place without that having happened. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I'm not sure how much time, if any, is left. If anybody had a question for the chat window, I'm not really sure what the time frame is like.
Well, we are a little behind moving it along,
Okay.
but Rustam, I think we have someone else to speak next.
Yeah, we have Paul King was scheduled now.
Paul, are you with us? There you are.
You can put me on video if you'd like.
I think you have to do that yourself.
All right, start my video. There we go.
There it is.
Hey, Paul.
Awesome.
I will spotlight.
Hey, Elayne. Hey, Elayne. First of all, sorry, as an aside, I never heard that story about your introduction to the Society of Janus. That's amazing. It was really incredible. I can't say congratulations enough to Jim. Certainly very, very well deserving in my worldview. For those that don't know, my name is Paul King, and I'm the founder and chair of the Body Piercing Archive. I'm the treasurer of the Association of Professional Piercers, the owner of San Francisco's Cold Steel Piercing Shop, and the proud recipient of the title Gauntlet Master Piercer. I want to thank Claw and the Leather Hall of Fame for inviting me to say a few words about Jim Ward. In my personal worldview, there is no self-made person. Behind every person singly acknowledged for outstanding achievement lies a complex web of conditions, time, place, upbringing, loving partners and mentors, supporting friends and community, all of which, when collected around a very special someone, conspire to shape greatness. So to begin, I want to acknowledge everyone remembered or forgotten here today or past that has been a contributing part of Jim's path. Jim didn't invent body piercing, the act of perforating human tissue for the insertion of adornment, but what Jim did was so much more. A major distinction of the 1970s social movements was the celebration and empowerment through the process of coming out, dropping charades of passing and confronting heterosexual norms in order to live one's life more honestly and more freely. In 1975, with the encouragement of a mentor, Jim's dexterous hands and clever mind, and a whole lot of chutzpah, Jim launched Gauntlet. He quickly set about evolving and innovating the rudimentary techniques, tools, and jewelry of an underground and closeted scene. Many entrepreneurs approach proprietary assets as precious trade secrets to be guarded. However, Jim chose to share them with the world by launching Piercing Fans International Quarterly, affectionately referred to as PFIQ magazine, and later video how-to series called Pierce with a Pro. The instructional step-by-step guides provided the initial training for hundreds of piercers who would go on to train thousands more. In 1978, bursting off the closet doors, so to speak, Jim Ward opened the first retail body piercing establishment in the Western world. It was a ground floor, glass-fronted retail shop on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood. People would travel from all over the world for his services, and many were inspired to follow his lead and open up their own shops. Jim remained tireless with his focus on sharing quality information. His eloquence and professionalism made Jim and Gauntlet a favorite with journalists, documentarians, kinky social groups, academics, and their students. Over decades, countless interviews and guest lectures continued to spread the good word and titillate imaginations. Jim brought folks in and trained them, opened new stores, and encouraged innovation and new ideas. The various locations with talented folks in a controlled yet open environment became a test kitchen of sorts for the advancement of the craft for what now had become a vocation. In 1994, a disorganized network of reluctant piercers were brought together to set standards for what was becoming a new industry. From Gauntlet's generous support and guidance, the Association of Professional Piercers was born. The APP is a California-based, international nonprofit organization dedicated to the dissemination of vital health and safety information about body piercing to piercers, healthcare professionals, legislators, and the general public. The APP helps write regulations for governing bodies and have helped educate thousands of piercers on safer practices. The annual conferences bring in more than 1,000 professionals from around the world for 1 week of learning and community building. During COVID, the online courses can have more than 500 attendees per class. In the US alone, there are believed to be over 25,000 body piercing and body piercing mixed tattoo shops, with dozens of premium manufacturers that have built businesses on the back of Jim's original designs and developments. The body piercing industry in the US alone is believed to have grossed over $1 billion in 2019. Let it sink in for a moment. For a vast majority of the Western world, other than earlobes, body piercing wouldn't even have thought to exist today if not for Jim Ward. Yeah, that's quite a statement, and I'm happy to defend it any day. In closing, I want to thank Jim for publishing Running the Gauntlet. This thoughtfully detailed book will remain a treasured resource for generations to come. And because you did such a great job, I don't have to write it, so thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jim. And all of that is said with great love.
Love you too.
Then we have 2 minutes for Gayle.
I'll try to, again, be brief. In 1978, I moved to the Bay Area and got involved in the local SM scene. I was young and impressionable, and so have very vivid memories about each new facet that I encountered. And one of the most memorable was a visit by Jim Ward, whom I think, was it Jim Kane who had arranged for you to come up here and maybe do a Janus program and then do a lot of private piercing?
Could very well be.
Anyway, you did. And I had never previously heard of Prince Albert's, but in the wake of that visit, I suddenly knew a whole bunch of guys who had gotten PAs or nipple rings. And my impression of you at the time was you were sort of a Johnny Appleseed of piercing. And I would concur with Paul that your impact on the emergence of modern body piercing and body modification simply cannot be overestimated. And I quickly will run through a few things, some of which overlap with what Paul said. But first, Jim and Doug Malloy essentially collaborated on establishing most of the basic repertoire of body piercing in the mid to late 1970s. They named them, Jim drew them, they popularized the fundamental set. More than that, Jim was particularly instrumental in developing the physical technology, the specialized tools, and the jewelry and the procedures for how to do all of this. And that also cannot be overestimated. One thing that I always was impressed with Jim when I first encountered his piercing was his focus on safety. And I found out from his memoir, Running the Gauntlet, that one of his sources was his mother, who had worked for an eye doctor for, I guess, a quarter of a century. So he was very familiar with the importance of proper sterilization. My own father was also an eye doctor, and so I grew up with some familiarity with sterile and clean procedure. And I was duly blown away by the care with which Jim conducted what amounted to quasi-surgical bodily invasions. And I read in the memoir that before he got an autoclave, he used a pressure cooker, which works. But it was, you always were really careful about these things. And that, I think, was critically important. So you were kind of first this itinerant piercer who brought this technology first to the gay men's leather population and then many other interested constituencies. And as Paul noted, you mainly did this through the shop Gauntlet. When you first opened Gauntlet, virtually no one but hardcore fetishists and SM enthusiasts were piercing themselves below the neck. But you were instrumental in changing that. And partly that's because Gauntlet was on Santa Monica Boulevard, which if I can remember the geography of LA, kind of runs from the beaches past UCLA, through West Hollywood into Hollywood and just basically all the way to Silver Lake. So every day, thousands of cars went by the shop. And the fact that it was there meant not only, oh, and the windows were open. You could see jewelry. I remember the first time I ever came up to the shop, in the window was one of those sunburst nipple shields that later became infamous with Janet Jackson's Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction. I don't know if she got it from you, but I first saw that design in the windows of Gauntlet. And because of the strategic location there, that's where a lot of musicians went to get their piercings, and those styles then got on MTV and then went out into Middle America, where hundreds of thousands of teenagers saw them and got interested in them. Wait a minute, I think I'm missing a page. I am. I'm going to have to go to my, sorry, my printer ran out of paper and I didn't realize that. So I'm going to go to my my actual document here, if I can find it. Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry. Here we go. Anyway, so and then the other thing I will have to say besides Gauntlet was PFIQ, the Piercing Fans International Quarterly, which was inaugurated in 1977 and published for 2 decades. PFIQ had a lot of facets, including interviews with key individuals and photos of visually arresting body art. But one of the major features was this series that Paul mentioned, Pierce Like a Pro, which began to disseminate step-by-step instructions on various piercings, starting with nipple piercings in issue number 2. And it continued to provide similarly detailed guides to all the major piercings. And I don't think one can overlook the generosity of this. Rather than keeping these technologies as proprietary, the magazine freely disseminated them such that new practitioners could pierce safely and properly. And these piercing clinics that were printed in PFIQ were among the most responsible for the explosion of piercing in the 1980s, because it meant that people who could not come to Gauntlet or some similar outlet in person, or who didn't have access to the piercing roadshows that Jim was doing, were able to learn how to pierce. So the magazine and these incredibly precise technological roadmaps were another way in which Jim Ward was the Johnny Appleseed of modern body modification. And I just can't thank you enough for everything you have done, Jim. You've had such an imprint on the 20th century and how people relate to their bodies and the ways that they do that. And I'm so glad we're celebrating you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayle.
Thank you. Drew Ward was our last speaker today, and 2 minutes.
Here I am.
What? Why is
Welcome, Drew. You're on.
There I am. Hi, thank you so much for giving me 2 minutes to talk about a man that I've known and loved for over 30 years. It's a story of fate, persistence, and good fortune. In the mid 80s and late 80s, I knew about Jim and his prominence in the leather community. And I knew a number of leathermen that got pierced by him. And I saw him in a number of articles, including in Drummer Magazine. And I was at a friend's house, and he had one of those articles on his coffee table, and I looked at it, and it was like the whole course of my life changed. I had to meet this man. And I thought about how to do that. I was very poor, and I saved up my pennies and made an appointment to go to Jim's shop in West Hollywood and get my nipples pierced. And so I flew down there, and there were 2 flaws in my plan. One was that I didn't know at that point what a consummate professional Jim was, and that as a piercing client, that's not going to be a way to strike up a social relationship. And the other one was I didn't check to make sure that Jim himself would be in the shop and available when I got pierced. He was in San Francisco that weekend. So I got my nipples pierced. I came back to San Francisco, and he was doing a piercing clinic at a Mr. S leather shop. And so I went there and I thought, oh, I can see him there. I caught him in between appointments and I pulled up my shirt and said, oh, I got my nipples pierced in your shop. I just want to make sure they're healing well. And he said, oh, they look fine. And that was the end of that. So I saw him at a gathering in an apartment on Folsom Street sometime later and basically just waved and smiled, and that was that. I found out that he was going to be doing piercings at a leather shop that's not there anymore, Image Leather, around the corner from where I lived. And so I hung out there all afternoon talking to him in between appointments. And thank the gods, he made the first move and suggested that we go have dinner after he was done at the Galleon, which was a restaurant down the street that offered discounts if you came in full leather gear. So I went home and I had my leather strewn all over my room, putting together just the perfect combination for this crucial first date. And I was putting on my boots, and when I pulled on my second Daner, I threw my back out. I was in tears, not only because of the pain, but because this was such an important event for me. So I hobbled back to the store, and Jim could see that not all was well. He asked me what happened, and I was embarrassed, and I told him, and we went back to my apartment so I could change into something that'd make me a little less pain. And we went and had our dinner, and we both ended up in tears expressing our feelings for each other. That was August 11th, 1988. Jim moved to San Francisco 4 months later to be with me, and we had our bonding ritual on February 4th, 1989. So he's been my boy all of that time. And then he had adopted me as his son. So he was my boss at Gauntlet, my father, and my boy, which was an interesting combination of relationships. And then we had to rescind the adoption to get married in October of 2013. And now we have this wonderful household of Jim and me and my collared boy, Eric, and our dog, Sparky. And it all started with my persistence in pursuing him back in 1988. And there's a picture of us getting married. So I hope I didn't take too much time, but it's a wonderful personal part of my life.
We wouldn't have missed it, Drew. That is terrific, terrific to hear.
Thank you.
Oh.
And there's our family.
Okay, I apologize for not thanking you all in turn. I was just trying to save time, but thank you collectively now that you are all done. And thank you also, and additional thank yous to those of you who tried to make it shorter because you realized that we were running late on time. I don't know, Bob, if we have time for, like, if somebody has like a vital question to ask or a vital comment to make, if we have time for that or not.
Any vital questions? Going once, going twice, going three times. All right. Any other questions? Please put them in the chat. Jim, can you stick around for a little while and answer things in the chat?
Certainly.
And we have 3 more sessions today before the social. And all 3 of them are aware of the schedule getting behind due to the media difficulties and power outage at Shannon's house. So our thanks in advance to all of them, starting with Sal Cicino from the Leather Heart Foundation.